Hi everyone, I'm Thomas Maurer and welcome to this video where we dive into a really exciting innovation in cloud computing, Azure Local. Whenever you are in IT, development, or business strategy, Azure Local is changing how we think about cloud infrastructure, sovereignty, and edge computing. But what is Azure Local? Azure Local is Microsoft's cloud-connected infrastructure solution designed for distributed locations. It brings the power of Azure services like compute, containers, storage, networking, AI, and many other things directly to your on-premises and even disconnected environments. It is enabled by Azure Arc, which means you get the centralized management, single control plane, security, and lifecycle operations directly from Azure as you know it. You can take advantage of the knowledge you already built in Azure, of the deployment processes you built for Azure, and also leverage that for your on-premises and hybrid infrastructure as well. But for whom is this designed, right? So not all workloads are fully cloud ready, right? Think about technical reasons where you want to run local AI and machine learning systems directly on the location you need it. Or think about other technical reasons like latency, network latency, where you need to have real-time systems very close by, or about mission-critical systems where you really don't want to rely on connectivity with your service provider, for example, to actually have that connection. Think about the factory where there's no reliable internet connectivity, but you don't want to stop the factory if internet connectivity goes down. So that is where you want to have some infrastructure specifically there as well. Same thing fully true for obviously retail, healthcare, and many other scenarios as well. And then also we have a look at sovereignty, right, and regulatory requirements. So in some cases, you are obliged to basically store data in your premises or different locations. When it comes to that, we offer that a lot. So there are obviously some really needs where you need to have hybrid solutions, even though the cloud is probably one of the best places to actually work with that when you have features like confidential computing and so on. However, again, in some cases, you need to have something on premises, and that is where Azure Local can come in. Now, if you look at a little bit more about Azure Local, as I mentioned, it's cloud-connected infrastructure solution where you're allowed to basically run services like VMs, Kubernetes, and other things on top of this, right? So we have here a little graphic showing what it can do. It basically runs on obviously physical hardwares from our OEM partners. So you have a big choice, and we will show you that later, what you need, from very small devices to very large, powerful clusters as well. And then we run our Azure Local software on top of that, which then offers, for example, virtualization and Kubernetes. And then obviously you can run Azure services on top of this. Like, for example, if you think about virtual desktops, Azure data services, AI and machine learning workloads, as well as, for example, Azure IoT operations. And all that is managed through the Azure control plane. So you basically connect up your hosts, your physical hosts, you connect them to Azure, you start building your cluster, you deploy it from Azure, you configure it from Azure, and then you do your operation task from Azure. And then if you want to deploy workloads on top of it, let's say you want to deploy a virtual machine, or you want to deploy a new Kubernetes cluster, or even then machine learning services, you can directly do this from the Azure control plane as well. Now, that said, Gartner also basically said Microsoft as a leader for their Magic Quadrant in 2024 for distributed hybrid infrastructure. So if you want to read that more, the link is in the description below, where it's really about, hey, how does Azure Local bring all that innovation for in that scenario? So let's dive in and let's have a look a little bit on the architecture and how it actually looks like before we then dive into some demos and talk a little bit deeper about certain things like availability, how to design the solution, and so on. So now let's have a quick look at the architecture here. As you can see here, when we start with this, we start with validated hardware. We will have a look a little bit later on what options do we have there, but basically these can be very small form factor devices up to large server systems, and you can basically scale from 1 to 16 nodes, really depending on what you need in terms of storage, compute, and networking requirements. So these nodes are hyper-converged nodes, meaning its compute and storage into one. So you don't need to have an additional storage or SAN storage available on that case. Then usually you build your cluster. In this case, we have a 6-node cluster. As you can see, we have 6 Azure local machines here. They're then connected to 2 top-of-the-rack switches, and they obviously are then connected to your environment in this case. Now, on top of this, again, we run the Azure Local software, where we always bring new releases as well. And that then offers you to build an Azure Local instance. This then can run, for example, Azure Local VMs, meaning this can be Linux or Windows Server or Windows VMs as well. You can also run on top of this Azure Virtual Desktop Session Hosts, and then you can also run AKS, our Azure Kubernetes service, on top of it for your container-based applications. And that also allows you then, for example, when you look at AI or IoT operations, to then run these Arc-enabled services on top of it. So this is a great way of the offering. And you can see here the Azure Local version then uses certain technologies like Hyper-V in the background and storage spaces direct to basically configure this. And then we also have a component, it's called the Arc Resource Bridge. And this is a managed solution part where basically this does the connection. So you can actually manage Azure Local from Azure. Again, and when speaking about the management, this is all done through the Azure control plane. So you can manage it through the Azure portal. You can use it in Azure Resource Manager. You can use ARM and Bicep templates, for example. You can use the CLI and other tools as well, directly working with the APIs. Similar exactly as you know when you work with Azure resources. And then we also offer a lot of these management services, which are basically offered in Azure as well, which then can basically be used on Azure Local as well. Now you can see here, obviously, when you log in into the Azure control plane, it makes use of Microsoft Entra ID so that you can get multi-factor authentication and conditional access policies, for example, so you can really secure who can actually manage that environment. And then it comes around to things like Azure Site Recovery, Azure Backup, Azure Monitor, and many, many other services you can enable. For example, also Azure Policies, which allows you to really configure your Azure environment, but also your Azure Local environment, as well as the workloads running on top of Azure Local as well. And then on the security side, we also offer Microsoft Defender for Cloud, again, on the host side as well as on the workload side using Azure Arc. And then the whole thing can be managed and updated through Azure Update Manager. So we can use Azure Update Manager again for the Azure Local system itself, where we have actually these monthly packages which we release, and then those basically update all the components of the system. And then you can also use Azure Update Manager if you want to basically manage the updates for your workloads running on top of Azure Local. For example, if you have Windows and Linux VMs, you can basically do the patch management through Azure Update Manager, similar as you would do it in Azure as well. And there is obviously much, much more to this, especially we didn't highlight and talked about right now about all the different AI capabilities, but we'll have that later on. But I want to now show you a quick demo of how Azure Local looks like in the Azure portal. So here we are in the Azure portal, and if I want to manage my Azure Local systems, I go to Azure Arc. That's where everything comes together, which is connected basically from the outside world of Azure into the Azure control plane. So that is also where you manage your, for example, Arc-enabled servers or Arc-enabled SQL servers as well. You can, as you can see here, you can also connect your VMware environments and so on. But in this case, I really want to talk about Azure Local. So if I click on Azure Local, you will basically get, first of all, to getting started page. That's what you will see, especially if you haven't deployed an Azure Local yet. And this will then also go through the process, and we'll do that a little bit later on, how you actually get Azure Local. Now, if you look at overview, I get a good overview about all my Azure Local systems here. I can see here if something is critical. You can see here we have 19 Azure Local instances, which are basically Azure Local clusters inside that environment. And then if I click on all systems, I can basically see all of them here as well. I can see their status. I can see if they have any alerts, if there are any updates needed, if there are any security recommendations, and so on. I see this nicely in this single control plane. Again, I'm showing this in the Azure portal, but this is also all available through the APIs as well. So if you want to manage that, for example, through ARM, you can do that too. So then you have different clusters here. For example, we can dive into the New York cluster here. Let's select this one, for example. And then you can see here, it looks like an Azure resource, right? It's joined to an Azure subscription. It's part of our Azure resource group. And then you can basically see here more and more information about this system. You can see here which hardware it runs. That is a 2-node cluster in this case. You can see here Defender is enabled, has recommendations, and so on. You can see it here, again, as an Azure resource, and you can see here the connectivity status as well. What you can also see here is the access control. So similar as I have with Azure resources, I can now take advantage of RBAC and basically provide access to my admin groups or people who need to manage Azure Local here as well. And then again, I can use tagging and so on as well. Now, if I click on Get Started, you can also see a couple of things, as I mentioned, what you can run directly on this. So you can obviously deploy virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, Azure Virtual Desktop, and we also allow you to actually deploy the multi-session versions here as well. And then you can also enable other things like Azure IoT operations and some other workloads as well directly from this. You can then start also look at monitoring. So if you want to look at what's going on this system, you basically get with Azure Monitor, you get all that information. This is just a few pins here you can see. And then if there are any alerts, they would also show up. And you can obviously also configure notifications so that you get, for example, a Teams message, a Slack message, you open a ticket in ServiceNow, you can send a text, whatever basically you can do with Azure Monitor there as well. And then we can look at some of the capabilities here, which you can enable. Again, insights, for example, when it comes to monitoring. We also have something called Windows Admin Center, and we'll show that in a bit later. You can also enable disaster recovery, like, for example, Azure Site Recovery. So you can replicate your virtual machines running on Azure Local directly to Azure. So in case your Azure Local instance or fails, or, for example, you have a data center outage or your edge location has an outage, you can basically fail over the workloads to Azure if you want to. There are also a couple of other availability options there as well, which we'll talk later about as well. And then again, you can enable security for the Azure Local services as well, but then also obviously for the workloads on top of it. Now, when you look deeper here, again, you can scroll down, you can basically see here the machines. So the machines are actually the Azure Local nodes. So these are the physical nodes of that environment. And you can see here, this is a 2-node cluster. So if I click on one of these nodes here, I can manage that specific node. I can see a little bit more information. I can see the operating system version it's running, and so on, and what's enabled. You could also basically do a connect to that cluster node directly. So when directly from the Azure portal in a secure way, so that you can basically, if there is anything wrong on that node and you need to troubleshoot it and you don't have VPN access or physical access, obviously, then you can do that securely through the Azure portal as well. And as you can see here, I have the possibility to do some other configurations here as well to have a look at specifically that physical machine. And if you're familiar with Arc-enabled servers, you can see here, this looks exactly as similar as it looks like with Arc-enabled servers. If I go back again, I quickly go back to this cluster. And if I scroll down, you can actually see the resources which I can run on these clusters. So for example, if I click on virtual machines, these are the virtual machines running on this system. I can then also go and create new virtual machines here, and I will show that later. Just let me go through quickly here as well. You can also see I have a couple of Kubernetes clusters here. So let's go and click on one of these. So you can see here, if you're familiar with AKS in Azure, this looks very familiar probably to that too. So you can actually go out and manage your Kubernetes cluster here directly from the Azure portal as it would run basically in Azure. Obviously, you don't have all the services and all the features in public Azure, but you have a very consistent experience here as well. And then again, you can scroll down and see multiple things. I mentioned data disaster recovery here, and we will talk about more about that a bit, but that basically helps you to set up Azure Site Recovery. We also have all the security features built in. So we really built this to be secure by default, right? And there's many security features there as well. Some of them are showing up here in the portal. So we have, for example, Microsoft Defender for Cloud here, which then basically gives you an overview with recommendations on that specific cluster here as well. So here you can now see, okay, not just like the Azure local system itself, but also, for example, the physical machines, as well as the virtual machines running on top of it, and the Kubernetes clusters on top of it, right? So it's an end-to-end, helping you with an end-to-end solution, not just like the physical part, but also the workload part. And again, this can be configured optional. You don't need to enable this if you don't want to. But again, this is offered here, and you can actually get a very good view on this. As mentioned, we have some security settings here as well. So by default, it should be really secure already. You can, by deploying this, you can see which security settings we recommend. They will be automatically set. You can also configure them the way you want it, but obviously it's highly recommended to basically enable these things like secure boot, the trusted platform module, for example, that this is present to actually take advantage of this, making sure that we have encryption policies in place and so on. You can also, there's also configured of application control, which is great because this allows, again, you can see here, this is not enforced in this specific demo, but you can go out and enforce it. And that helps obviously to make sure that there's no malicious app be able to run on the Azure local nodes there as well. And then if you look at data protection, you can actually see that we have encrypted the volumes, right? So even the storage volumes for the virtual machines, as well as the OS disks for the Azure local nodes as well. And you can make sure that everything there is encrypted. And again, you see this here. And if something would change, you could basically have a look at it as well. And then also when it comes to SMB traffic, which is basically the traffic, the storage traffic between the nodes, for example, that this is actually SMB signed and so on. Now, on the monitoring side, you can go in and basically have a look a little bit more on this monitoring data here as well. So again, you would obviously see here if there is anything coming up, what you need to take care of. You can also look at the health here, and it says, okay, there are some warnings here you need to take care of here as well. So you get all that in the single view. You have a view of the nodes. Now, to get the health information and usage information of the specific nodes, right? So you could see if one of the nodes needs to perform higher, and then you could see which VMs would basically running on that system. You can have a look at that. You can also monitor the virtual machines running on this. So you know, okay, which ones are running state and so on. And then the same thing, by the way, on the storage side, it's also very important to actually look at that. You can see if there are any changes in I/O, latency and throughput, for example, and you get all that information directly, again, in the Azure portal here to have a look at. Now, let's have a look at some of the workload sides here as well. I also have my OneNode Azure local cluster here, which you can have. Again, in that case, you can build it as a OneNode solution. And then you basically, I recommend obviously that you mirror your disk inside of it. So at least when a disk fails, there's no data corruption or the system keeps on running. However, obviously, if the whole node fails, then you don't have a very high availability. Again, this is where if you build it with single node, but of course, if you need the high availability, you can build up clusters from 2 to 60 nodes as well. So this one is running actually not in a data center, but actually underneath my desk here. And so I can basically manage this, again, this machine directly from the Azure portal, where I can look at, okay, what is going on here. And I could also go in, for example, let's say I want to deploy a new virtual machine. So I have a virtual machine here already. So before I deploy one, let me show you how this one looks like. So again, if you're familiar with Arc-enabled servers, this looks pretty much like an Arc-enabled server. However, it has a couple of extra features like you would get for like an Azure virtual machine, right? So you can now stop and restart the machine as well as start it if it's off. You can do other lifecycle tasks here as well. You can, for example, go and configure networking for that machine, change it, add a network interface, and so on. You can manage the disks for that virtual machine as well, if you want to add a new data disks to that system as well, changing the size, obviously, of that machine here as well, or adding a GPU. So we spoke about Azure Virtual Desktop as well as, for example, AI workloads or machine learning workloads. So we allow you to basically also add GPUs to your Azure local system and basically use that and then assign this to your virtual machines or Kubernetes clusters as well to run these workloads. You can also configure, obviously, as I mentioned, this one is now the security for the virtual machine itself. I can go out and see, okay, how is that configured? This is now really the view on this specific virtual machine. And then really cool things I can do from Arc directly. For example, I can assign security policies, or think about this as group policies on steroids, directly from the Azure portal. So there are some technical policies I could assign, or there are also some regulatory policies we have in the Azure portal, or you can build your own policies and assign these to your servers and Kubernetes clusters as well to actually audit these systems and also obviously configure them if you want to. Now you can see here that there's one or two assigned to this on a higher level. I don't need to do this per machine. I can do this on a subscription, management group, resource group level, whatever is the right path for me. And then I get these kind of like information here if I'm actually compliant with that system or not. I also get things like update management, so I can manage the patches for that system. I get like software inventory for that machine here as well. And if I need to connect directly to that machine from the Azure portal, I can do that using Windows Admin Center, or I can also do an RTP or SSH session tunneled through the Azure control plane, and I will put a link how this works into the description of that video, so you can basically build this yourself. And again, this takes all in consideration because it uses your Entra ID account. You get multi-factor authentication, you can get conditional access policies and so on, so that it's really secure for your admins. And everything basically you do gets actually logged, right? So you have that in the activity log, that information, so you can see who and when the changes to that virtual machine in this case. Now, if I want to deploy a new workload, it's as easy as going to create VM. And then if you're familiar deploying a VM on Azure, this looks very familiar. So you would basically go and select the resource group. So I have Zurich VMs here, for example. And then I give the VM a name. And then it will basically see here, tell me, hey, this is the custom location, because I directly chose already the specific Azure local cluster. It will basically give me that Zurich location here, and then it will tell me, because it's Azure local, the virtual machine kind is Azure local. I can then also select the security type. We support obviously standard, and then you also have trusted launch as well. And we also have confidential computing on the roadmap for this as well, where you can actually encrypt the data in use, so the memory of the virtual machine. So you get from encryption in transit, encryption at rest, and also encryption in use as well. But again, those are features in preview. And then you can select your images. Now, I will show you how to manage these images in just a bit, but you have basically multiple options. You can use some from the Azure Marketplace, or you can build your own images as well. And then you configure the size, the typical settings you would do. Again, you could enable GPU here as well. And then you can basically say, hey, I want the Arc-enabled management within the guest operating system enabled or not, right? So in some cases, you probably don't want to use that. But in general, I think with all the benefits I just showed you, you basically keep this on if you want to. If not, that's fine too. Again, and then the question is, okay, if this is enabled, how would that connect? So would it use public endpoints through a proxy, or would it use the Arc gateway as well? So this is a whole other topic, but we have this Arc gateway, so we can have a centralized connection, and not every server directly needs to connect to the Azure endpoint as well. As, for example, it does simplify the actual ports and URLs you need to whitelist for this as well. So look at the Arc gateway when it comes to connection. Great feature there as well. And then if I select, I will now select that image, of course, and the security type. Just to go next in the step, I will then set username and password. If I type correctly. Oh, that's exactly what happens. So let me do it that way. And then I can also enable this using like a domain join, for example. So if I have a local domain, I want this server to be joined, I could enable that. And then obviously it would ask me with what user I want to do the domain join with. And then if I go to next, I could add some data disks here as well. Again, we selected obviously with the image, it already creates the operating system disk, but if I want to add some data disk, I can do that too. I can configure the network interface. So if I, for example, have I already designed the logical network, so it would already meaning that I already selected the specific VLAN, for example, I want to have this in. If I don't have VLANs, that's fine as well. We can obviously go path through with this. And then we can enable features like network security groups here as well. Now, for just going run through, we need to have, because we have guest management, network 01 and Zurich, and add that interface here. Again, this is now configured to run on DHCP, but again, you can configure that the way you want it and even assign physical IP addresses here as well. And then we can use Azure tagging to tag the resource, and then we can just go and create. And as you can see here, obviously, we can download the template for this. So if you want to use infrastructure as code or you want to build some automation using scripts, you can do this too, right? This is not something where you always need to go through this wizard. You can use several different options here as well. So let me go back to this location here. What I quickly want to show you is the update management. So for update management here, I could go and basically see here if there's an update available. I could choose that, and then it would tell me that basically there's an update available. Now, since there's no update available, it tells me there's no update available. But again, I could then select and say one-time update. I could also go to Update Manager here, and then instead of patching my virtual machines, which run in Azure, or my Arc-enabled servers, which run on-prem, we can also manage Azure Local here. So again, you can see here where there's an update available. So for example, the Dallas cluster here, there would be an update available. I could basically go and say one-time patching and basically patch that system. And this would patch all the components, not the workloads on top of it. For that, I can run a separate thing directly here on machines, but it would basically patch the infrastructure for that specific cluster with all the nodes and so on. And obviously would do that in a high available way. So workloads would be moved from one node to the other one. The node which has no workloads on top of it would basically be patched and restarted, validated, and then would happen to the next node and so on, so that you don't have any service interruption there as well. So let me jump back and let's talk a little bit about availability options and other stuff as well. Now let's talk about some of the availability and resiliency options on Azure Local and what you get with Azure Local. As I mentioned before, it's a hyper-converged infrastructure cluster, meaning that compute and storage are basically in one node as well and combined. And through the magic of our hyper-converged infrastructure software, basically you get the different types of resiliency across the different nodes. So for that, on the storage side, we're using actually Storage Spaces Direct, which is a technology proven for years, which worked in Windows Server first, and then obviously over the years in Azure Stack HCI and now parts of Azure Local. So again, there's different resiliency options there, but it basically allows you to use low-cost disks, which are still certified for Azure Local, and then choose different resiliency level, like two-way mirrors or three-way mirrors, so that when one node fails, obviously the data is not impacted, or even if two nodes fail, the data is not impacted. Again, depending on your needs and depending on how many systems do you have, you can configure that. And it also provides really, really high performance in terms of storage, throughput, and IOPS as well. So depending on the disk you choose, the performance is going to be really, really good. And then there are obviously other things for resiliency as well, backup and disaster recovery. So you can use Microsoft Azure Backup, for example, with the backup server and things like that to basically back up these VMs on premises, or also then from there to the Azure cloud. You can use, as I mentioned before, you can use Azure Site Recovery to replicate VMs to Azure, and in case of a disaster, you can actually like restart or start these VMs in Azure, and then also fail them back once the problem is resolved. But then in a case where you can't really like replicate that data to Azure, and you want to have probably two instances of Azure Local, you can also configure Hyper-V Replica. So that replicates the VMs from one Azure Local instance to the other one. And then basically you can also fail them over and fail them back if needed. So if you have, for example, two data center locations, that's one way you could get resiliency there, or disaster recovery in this case. And then we also introduced a preview feature called rack-aware clusters. We heard from customers that they want to have, for example, two rooms at the same site or two racks at the same site. And that's what you can do with rack-aware clusters. Again, this is a preview feature. And so what you need to have there is a common layer 2 network. And then we can configure the clusters that they understand that, for example, these 3-4 nodes are on this side of the rack, on this rack, and then the other ones are on the other rack, or these are in this room and this is in the second room, so that you can actually make sure that the data is split across these specific locations. And then there are some really, really great partner options. Just to list a few, we have Commvault, Rubrik, and Veeam, which offer really, really cool solutions to backup and also have disaster recovery in place there as well. So again, there's many, many choices you can have. So if you're, for example, an existing customer for one of these partners, you can integrate Azure Local in that as well. So we don't force you to change, obviously, your backup or disaster recovery strategy if you already have something great in place with our partners. So another thing I want to talk about is security. I mentioned that already, and I showed a couple of features already, which we have in Azure Local. But again, this goes through that we really have one of a very strong security by default for the infrastructure where Azure Local, but then also for the apps and applications and workloads running on top. So again, there's a little bit of a list here. What you can see, I already mentioned some of the tooling you can use. For example, Azure Policy and security settings for all operating system configs on the Azure Local nodes, but then also for the VMs running on top of it. We also can then obviously use security benchmarks and other things to do that. And then we also have security posture management with Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, and Defender for Cloud. And you obviously also be able to send those data to, for example, Microsoft Sentinel as well. And then we have different technologies already in place for VM isolations. We have just privileged access configurations in place there as well. On the network side, you can use basically some features like network security groups. You also have new announced SDN features as well. And then I mentioned that we were offering VMs with trusted launch and working, for example, on confidential compute there. And I showed you also what we do, for example, on the encryption space for like encrypting data at rest. So you can protect there as well. And then there's a couple of other things. Again, I don't want to talk too much about this. We will have another video focusing on security for Azure Local on this channel. So again, feel free to subscribe and basically get that video as soon as it's available. And so one thing I want to quickly also show you is that we go back into the Azure portal, and there I want to show you something very specific, especially if you have these distributed sites in place, right? So imagine you have 10, hundreds, maybe thousands of different locations where you need to manage these clusters. Now, again, I showed you this here, and you can see here, for example, as I showed you, the Dallas Azure Local here instance here, and then you can open it up and see, for example, the VMs and services which are running on top of that. But we also offer here the Azure Arc Site Manager, so that you can basically get an overview, not just about Azure Local, but also on the workloads running on top of this, so that you can manage different sites. This is also interesting together with, for example, Azure IoT Operations as well. So you can directly get an overview about your sites, and then you can obviously go into the site manager itself and have these different sites here as well. Now, An Azure Local doesn't necessarily need to be in a site, but you can configure it to be. So for example, I have the Zurich site here on the bottom, so I can see what's going on here. And this is basically then, if I click on this site, I can actually see what's running in there, right? So I see, okay, so I have, like, for example, one Azure Local, I have an Arc enabled server in this. If I have any, for example, Kubernetes clusters or any IoT assets there, I can basically have a look at this as well, and I can see all this information about this site and this configuration. Now, that said, you can also, for example, have multiple Azure Locals obviously on this site. And then you can also give, for example, different permissions in role-based access control to these sites, for example, as well. So in this case, you could basically allow different rights on this, and they have different people on this based on like resource groups and subscriptions. So this is pretty cool if you have these multiple sites and you want to have a good way to organize these as well. Now, we spoke about now different ways. I showed you basically the Azure portal, like the control plane, how to manage this. Now, one request, obviously, the team had a lot was about what about these disconnected or air-gapped environments? And at Ignite in 2024, the Azure Local team announced Azure Local Disconnected Operations. And so let me go back here to the slides here. This is a way to actually run Azure Local in an environment where you all have these permanent disconnected requirements, if there are regulatory requirements, or even if it's just a place where, okay, hey, there is no connectivity usually, but I need to have some infrastructure. So what we do then is basically you have this appliance VM, which is basically replacing the Azure control plane or offering the parts of the Azure control plane directly within that infrastructure as well. And it allows you to, as you can see here, again, manage the infrastructure of Azure Local, but then also some of the workloads which run on top. Now, again, this will integrate into existing systems for identity monitoring and PKI, because again, not all of these services we offer in Azure are going to be available locally. And you can also see that there is a list of like subset of these services which will be available for Azure Local Disconnected. Now, again, this is a preview feature which you can try out. And obviously, depending if you follow us, you will see more when those services go GA or when you get access to all of that. So now you might ask, okay, we have like other workloads requirement. Thomas, you talked about AI quite a bit. What is there? So we offer a couple of AI services for the edge or these environments. So for example, we have Azure Machine Learning enabled by Azure Arc, which we offer for quite some time now. We also talked about or showed basically on our blogs and talked about Edge Rec and Azure AI Video Indexer, which are very great solutions to run actually directly on these locations where you need it. So for these types of scenarios, we have solutions there in place as well. So we also, in addition to that, I need to mention KAITO, the Kubernetes AI toolchain operator. So to basically run and deploy your AI models on your Kubernetes cluster. And that basically also is in preview for Azure Local here as well, available through the AKS enabled by Azure Arc extension, so that there's also a way to leverage that in case you're building solutions with that as well. Good. So the next thing I want to talk about is, okay, how do I actually get an Azure Local and how do I actually look at this? Now, there are different types. Before I go into this, there are different types of Azure Local in the solution categories, which I need to mention here quickly. We have this large amount of partner solutions out there, which allow you really to choose different OEMs, different providers, basically different hardware providers. Where it depends on your needs or your favorites or the contracts you have in place. And then there's like basically 3 categories where we have in place. So there's validated nodes, there's integrated systems, and then there are premier solutions. And as you can see, they all have different levels of testing and integration. And I usually highly recommend to go obviously with integrated systems or premier solutions. But then on the other hand, with validated nodes, you have a lot more flexibility and think choices there to make. Now, you're going to ask, okay, what is the best way to now figure out all these things, right? You show this slide and that's great, but let's go and have a look at the Azure Local Solutions Catalog. So this is a website you can go to, aka.ms/Azure Local Catalog. And then I will also put this link in the description below. And there's two things here I want to show you. First of all, there's the catalog, and then there's the Azure Local Sizer. So once you want to figure out, okay, what do I actually need, then you can use the sizer to define the workloads you run on top. What should be, for example, do you need GPUs and things like that. So the sizer will give you recommendations. So what you can do if you go to the Azure Local Catalog, and I'm going to zoom in here a little bit more, you can see here, you can select these different solution categories, for example. You can choose the different form factors, the solution builder, basically. Again, you can see here, we have quite a few OEMs here, and we have currently like 181 platforms in this catalog. Again, this varies, like there could be more in the future as well, depending on what the solution builders basically provide here as well. So again, you can select by this, and then you can also define, okay, what do I need? Do I need a small 1-node, 2-node, 3-node, 4-node cluster, or do I need to go higher, or do I want to have a specific setting here as well? You can also purchase this as a service, right? So instead of like just going out, downloading the software, getting this all done, you can also, from some of our vendors, actually purchase this as a service. And so they will basically help you with that. Again, depending on the vendor, the different types of services available. As you can see here, it really depends a little bit on the vendor what these services include. But again, this is also a great choice if you don't want to deal with it by yourself. You can make choices in terms of what CPUs to use. Do you need GPU support, and which GPU support do you need? Do you need DDA, direct discrete device assignment, or GPU partitioning? So you can choose that as well, depending again on what your requirements are. You can choose which type of hard drives or storage you need, right? If you want to do NVMe, SSD, HDD, all of it, or just one of it, or a certain combination. Again, this depends a little bit on cost performance ratio, for example. And then we have like other features like which are support. So do you need Microsoft SDN? Do you need secure core servers, ruggedized systems here as well if they are transported into the field, for example? You have quite a few options there as well. And then obviously you want to choose the region you want to make this available, and not all vendors do offer in all of the regions. It really depends. And then also, of course, what basically platform lifecycle you want to choose. And then you get different options here. Again, whatever your choice is from the different vendors here, there's quite a few options. And those are, again, commodity servers, generally speaking. There's not something like very special about them. They have certain network adapters, for example, and other things which you could also purchase standalone. But again, they're specifically designed and validated for these kind of scenarios as well. So now you want to figure out, okay, what systems do I actually need? So what you could do is basically you could go into the sizer and create a new project, and I will just quickly show you how that looks like. And this was, again, is not like 100% accurate, right? You will always have to figure out some stuff, especially, but it will give you a little bit of a starting point how to size your Azure Local solution here. Hey, do I want to integrate systems or validated node? In my case, let's choose an integrated system. I can then choose the CPUs I want to choose. I want to which vendor I want to choose. So you can see here, some of them are grayed out because they don't offer, for example, like integrated systems, right? So if I do validated nodes, then I have a larger list here as well. So let's go for this one. I go with integrated system. Let's choose, for this case, you just use HPE here. But again, you choose your OEM or your solution builder you're most comfortable with, or you want to compare different ones to figure out which one to use. This is actually where you can look at this as well. And then you can also have different options here in terms of, okay, what do I want on the high availability? Is it N+1 or is it N+2? Storage failures to tolerate. So look, usually can choose 2 or 1. And then obviously storage type. Now in my case, Let's go with any for this case, but you could also choose like all VMA, all flash, or hybrid. So depending on the cost performance ratio you want to have, you can also go with HDD disks as well. If you just have a lot of like very cold data, for example, this is a great way to do that. And then there's multiple advanced options there as well. You can define the growth here. You can then also mark, for example, if you require additional memory expandability scenarios, for example, as well. And then you add your workloads here. So in this case, for example, you can choose the different types of workloads. You can choose General, SQL, or Azure Virtual Desktop. Let's choose General, and then you would give that workload a name. You can say, okay, this is like 10 VMs, and for these, we use 4 virtual CPUs, and the ratio from virtual to physical CPUs should probably be 6, which is a good number to start with. But again, depending on what like your experience is or what do you want, you can choose different types there. You can then define the memory. Let's say we do, like in this case, these VMs have 8 gigs of memory, depending on the storage, and add that workload. Now you can obviously add then multiple workloads here to just figure out what it is, but for now, for sake of this demo, we just go through this, and then you see the result here, what the recommended system is, right, for this specific one from that vendor now I chose. And again, it gives you some information about this. Now, since I don't have a lot of, since these systems which I now chose are like this, and I did not add a lot of workload here on this, it gives me a pretty small system, but it still has a lot of leftover room here to actually grow. Again, I chose these 20%, but you can also obviously go higher than this as well. And again, it calculates this based on CPU, memory, and storage here as well. And then you can save it, or you can use this and then go and talk with your solution builder. Again, there's a catalog listing here, then brings you back to the catalog, where you then find more information about this specific solution here as well. So this is about the actual hardware solution you get. You can purchase this directly from your preferred vendor, which is in this catalog. And then you also have to license, obviously, the Azure Local license. That includes basically, let me quickly switch here to Azure Local pricing. So this is the official pricing page. No thanks, I don't need help right now. You can choose which region are you connected to, and then, for example, are you paying in euros or US dollars? So in this case, I chose euros. For example, this is 9 euros per physical core a month. So it's based on physical cores you have in your Azure Local instance. Again, this is a monthly fee, so you pay monthly for this. If you then turn it off, you don't get charged after the end of the month anymore. And then you can also, if you quickly switch, for example, to US dollars, this is the default price we have is $10 per physical course. I know, because also a lot of people from the US are watching these videos. So again, chose the right pricing, so you figure out, but it's fairly simple. And that price includes basically the Azure Local virtualization software, basic management capabilities, and then also the cost for AKS on top of it. Now, there is some, if you then enable some of the features, for example, if you do Azure Monitor, Defender, and all that, and workload specific services, for example, the cost is then pay per use, similar as you have in Azure for these additional services you enable, right? A great thing also is that you can also, if you're going to get your Windows Server licenses, if you don't have any and you need them, you can also license this directly with this pay-as-you-go option and make that available there as well. Now, that said, if you already have Windows Server data center licenses with software assurance, you can basically trade in these licenses or these cores for basically cores on Azure Local. So this is the Azure Hybrid benefit for Azure Local. Again, I put the link into the description below. And as you can see here, you can basically exchange these licenses. So in this case, then you get Azure Local and AKS on top of it for no additional cost. So that is already great. So if you're already a Windows Server customer with software assurance, this is probably a great benefit for you here as well. So with that, I hope I gave you a short overview about Azure Local. There is obviously much more to cover. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment. I will try to answer them as well. I will put a lot of the links and documentation information about Azure Local into the chat. If you want to see another video on one specific topic or you want to learn more, let me know in the comments as well. And with that, thank you and hope you subscribe to the channel and see you in the next one.